This morning, we're going to be looking at, in the 7 letters to the churches, Revelation chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 8 through 11. So, Revelation 2, 8 through 11. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you're rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you'll suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Or this translation is, I'll give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. The ancient city of Smyrna is an amazing city. For nearly 300 years after the Greek Lydians laid the city to waste, it just kind of laid there. And then Alexander the Great came along and rebuilt the city. The city was renowned for an occasion where prior to one battle, the head of the army sent back to the city that the soldiers didn't even have enough clothing to stay warm. So all of the city population of Smyrna, everybody gave their coats, sent them to the army. And the emperor was so impressed by that, that later on in AD 26, the Emperor Tiberius chose it to be a special city and to set up a special temple in his honor. So he kind of repaid them for helping out the soldiers. And so it was kind of known for that. It was also called one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. It had a famous street of gold. And some people think that this may be the reference later on in the book of Revelation where heaven's a street of gold. But that street of gold comes from the imagery of the actual street of gold in Smyrna. It kind of went through town, went around, and ended up kind of at the end of town, but going around the hillside. I'm not sure who built it, but they were famous for it. And as a result, on the end of town, they had these trees and groves that lined the city streets. It was called one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. It was also an important center for medicine and for the sciences. Now, we don't normally think of the medicinal world and the science world being much in operation back then, but as much as they knew about medicine and as much as they knew about science, and a lot of the science was more along the line of engineering, but apparently Smyrna was one of the great centers of learning for medicine at that time and also for engineering. So it's a nice bustling little city. And we're going to see here in a moment, the church is struggling in this particular town. And I want to talk a little bit about the small church and its identity. We live in America where, and I'm going to be on my soapbox a little bit, so y'all ready for this? We live in America where for too long, we've assumed that the church is not what it should be unless it's a large church. And what I've noticed through the years is smaller churches that live in the shadow of a big mega church, they have a self-identity problem. It's like, well, we're just poor, pitiful us. And I've been at a church where, living in the shadow of a big mega church, one of our leaders wanted to be a big church. and tried to make it that way. And it was a fiasco. It was a disaster. Um, there are tremendous advantages to the small church, such that we can begin by saying, and we know this from the New Testament, the earliest congregations met in people's homes. So they were small churches. And there was a Christian writer about 100 years ago that made in something that he was saying about the early church, it made such an impression on my thinking. He said, think about how the gospel was spread. I mean, there were occasions where someone like Paul would stand on the street corner and preach Jesus, but that was kind of unusual. Most of the time, people were led to Christ in small house churches in the context of hospitality. And if you think about that, that's a very powerful thing, where you've got people inviting people into their home, inviting them to the table to eat and to have fellowship, and you would have an impact on them and draw them to Christ that way. So the small church has always been part of the history of the church. There's a book that I've been reading called Preaching and Worship in the Small Church. Excellent work by Will Willimon, who's the author. But as we think about it, I'm going to highlight 5 things, and it may be that the church at Smyrna forgot about how important they were, even though they're a small church and they're struggling and they're going through afflictions and poverty. We're going to mention that in a minute. But the church, as a small church with its identity, this church, Smyrna, knows the resurrection Son of Man. They responded to Jesus. The small church is a context where you can share the gospel in a very personal way. Too often, large churches, in order to stay large, evangelism almost becomes kind of like a mechanistic thing. But the small church can be more personal. The assembly and the gathering for the small church, worship is so critical for the life of the church. Now, unfortunately, sometimes, and I've seen this, I've seen people even do some research and writing on this. The larger the church gets, the less the Bible has the place in the assembly. That too often, the Sunday morning assembly becomes an entertainment put together for everyone. And that's unfortunate, because the Bible and worship, singing, there is a website on the Facebook I see all the time. It's by a man named Joshua Gilbert. I don't know him, but he is advocating gospel hymns. He's afraid that in many of the churches, they've forgotten the old gospel hymns, and some churches that's true. And then the other day he said, you know, I really advocate congregational singing. I'm like, well, we already know that. The power of hymns, our worship together, where the Word of God is highlighted. We also hear prayers prayed. We gather around the communion table. Those are things that we as a small church enjoy. And it's what draws us together. It's part of our spiritual growth together and our fellowship. The Bible is taught and preached and faithful to the traditions that have been handed down. And the church here at Harriman, we have some faithful traditions, good for the church, and we want to keep emphasizing those. But the Bible is taught and preached in the small church. In the small church, everyone knows everyone's business. And that can be a good thing. Some people say that can be a bad thing. But think about it. When we know everything about each other, we can encourage and support each other and come alongside and help and support when people need that. And then, this one's important, that the memory of loved ones in the congregation who have passed on are still part of the church's identity. So whether we're talking about Freeman or Larry, and I was just thinking of all those that we've lost since Nancy and I have been here, but you all know a whole bunch more, don't you? People who used to be sitting in the seats beside you, They've now gone on. But guess what? In your mind, that still is part of the congregation. And that's part of the way you think about the people of God. Small churches can do that. If you're in a large church, you can't do that. But small churches do that. So just to encourage you that being part of a small church is part of God's plan. Not that we're failing because we're not a mega church. We need to hear that more and more. Okay? The church knows this resurrection Son of Man. I want to talk about that in a moment, because did you notice how this letter starts off? It starts off, these are the words of him who is the first and the last. He died and came to life again. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we read in chapter 1. And that's part of what he did to the church at Ephesus. Went back and reappropriated the description of the Son of Man in each of these letters. He's the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. He encompasses everything in our spiritual life. See, if I believe that Jesus is the first and the last, that means my whole life is under his rule. My entire life is open to him. He's the first and the last. He has the first say and he has the last say. He has complete rule in my heart. For Jesus to be the first and the last, everything else comes under that. And it's amazing admission of Jesus being our Lord. Also, he died. He didn't die a natural death. He died because he was intentionally crucified. And I believe that in the book of Revelation, the Christians are going to be alerted over and over again. Listen, you facing death is nothing new. You're following Jesus Christ, who himself died. He was crucified. But guess what? The Lamb that was slain is now alive. The Lord that was crucified has now been raised. And that's the affirmation here. He came to life again. And the word again is important. He came to this earth. He embodied human life. Well, the Roman officials thought, and the Jews thought, they got rid of him because they killed him. Well, what they didn't know was he was coming back to life again in human form before he ascended into heaven. So the church here knows the resurrection Son of Man. This church needed a new self-understanding. Now, it was going through afflictions. The word here, I think the King James says tribulation. It's a good word. It can refer to all of the different pressures, all of the different persecutions, everything they were being faced with because they were a church. And if you think the continuum of what that could be for a church, all the way from social pressure to change things, to someone storming the doors of the church or coming into a house. And remember back in Acts, we know this. What did Saul do? He had letters from Damascus, and he had official letters to go into people's homes and to bind men and women who were Christians and haul them off to prison. So that's probably, and then of course, Christians being beheaded, and we read about that later in Revelation. So you've got this big, wide continuum of what the tribulation can look like. It can be a very difficult thing for people to go through. These afflictions took on many forms, and it looks like, I get the feeling that the reason Jesus says, yet you are rich, is that this little church in Smyrna took on, and it apparently had the effect of what I call the poor, pitiful me syndrome. Or you may remember when Israel got ready, God was preparing them to go into the promised land. And their response was, after the 12 spies came back, we can't do that. We're just like grasshoppers in the sight of these giants. Well, if the church has this poor, pitiful me syndrome, because of what it's going through, it's going to lose its courage, its effectiveness, and its willingness to be light in the culture. And it struggled with poverty. This was a very real thing in the ancient world. Poverty among Christians was a common fact of life in the church. And it may be that with this church being a house church in Smyrna, they could look around and see the bustling city, probably a lot of well-to-do people around them. And so here's a church filled with people that are in poverty and thinking, maybe we're not as good as they are. But see, we have to understand our relationship with God is not measured by physical blessings. Now, there are preachers and teachers that will tell you that today. You can turn on the television, you can turn on the radio, and they will promise you, if you send me so much money, you can be blessed. Or if you can pray hard enough and claim a blessing, it will be yours. And so when you hear all of that, I've always wondered, how do they incorporate then the prevalence of suffering in this world, and especially suffering because you've been called to be a Christian? Do they just ignore all of that? Well, yeah, it'd be nice if all we ever had is, in fact, you might have a few more people become Christians if the Christian message were something like, boy, if you become a Christian, guess what? You're going to be rich physically. Your bank account is going to improve. You're going to get rich. Well, they were rich, but in different ways. They had a poor, pitiful me syndrome, and Jesus is having to remind them, even though you're in the midst of poverty, you are rich. And I thought about, can you imagine a church having to rethink about who it is in society and to reflect on how it is rich? Well, that question is a very real one for us here at Harriman. How are we as a congregation rich? Because we struggle financially, don't we, Debbie? And we know that's been the history of the church here for a while. So how are we rich? Oh boy, how much time have we got? I mean, if we started thinking collectively about this, I mean, we could just go on all afternoon. Rich in the fellowship that we have, rich in the friendships, brothers and sisters in Christ, rich in prayers being answered, rich in support when we're going through hard times. We can just keep going on and on and on. Rich in all the promises that we've experienced that come from God. Rich in the resources that we've got to fight the devil. I don't know if you've thought about that. God hasn't left us, to go into battle with nothing to fight with. We're rich in the supplies for the battle even. So we could just go on and on about how we're rich. This ties to a major perspective in the book of Revelation. Things are not always as they seem on the surface for the Christian and for the church living during tough times, tumultuous times in an antagonistic culture. I will make a blanket statement here, and you can fill in the details, but I believe that the church is living in a culture that is slowly becoming more and more antagonistic toward it. That there's more and more challenges. And I don't think we're going to see the worst of it, perhaps as we pass on, but our children and grandchildren, I can imagine, are going to face things we didn't even know were possible. So that there's going to be very difficult things that have to be faced because, people, I think for a good reason, have quit referring to America as a Christian nation. Now, it may have been founded on some Christian principles, but a lot of those are going by the wayside. And you know that. We all know that. So our faithfulness, and I think this is what Smyrna Church struggled with, but our faithfulness doesn't depend on how supportive culture is for the life of the church. What the church or what the government and what leaders and what culture does not affect our faithfulness, or it shouldn't. Remember the song we just sang this morning, how firm a foundation. Well, There's nothing in this world that's going to shake our faith. Now, Satan's going to try, but culture is antagonistic often with the church itself. This church also had to withstand slander. Now, we don't know everything that was being slandered. Well, I wish more detail were here. Inquiring minds want to know. But slander, first of all, is always known by the Lord. And remember, he'll say in each of these letters, I know this about you. He knows that there are people slandering the church. And so one of the things that we have to entertain is the fact, and this is very real for Christians, every single thing we say about somebody, the Lord knows. And it better be true. If we slander someone, the Lord takes note of that. And I'm just afraid that through the years we haven't been as careful. And of course, I'm thinking about myself. There are times when I don't think I've been as careful with my speech as I should have been, knowing that the Lord knows every single thing we say. See, what we say has to represent our faith. Now, slander is a misrepresentation to destroy one's reputation. Whoever these people are that are involved in slander in this church at Smyrna, their intention was to destroy its reputation. And slander, as you know, is the opposite of encouragement. So they were not getting any encouragement. This misrepresentation was by a group of people who came into the church at Smyrna saying that they were Jews, but they were not. Now, it makes you wonder. I wonder if in the early church and some of the house churches, if it was known that you were a Jew, you would say, well, come on in. I mean, we've got some things in common here. And they would try to use that common ground to convert a Jew. But here are some people misrepresenting themselves so that they could come into the church at Smyrna and destroy its reputation. You talk about mean-spirited. When the attitude of mean-spirited gets mixed up with religion, it's always ugly. You can always count on it. It is always ugly. They were no doubt trying to pass themselves off, maybe even as Jewish Christians, but this was their operation. And it's so offensive to Jesus that the characterization and the label that he uses would be strongly offensive to any faithful Jew. Guess what? He says they're from the synagogue of Satan. Whoa. The synagogue, do you catch that? That's a slap in the synagogue of Satan. It'd be almost like someone saying, well, the church where you're going is so bad, it's just the church of Satan. We go, whoa, wait a minute. So this is strong language. And they're having to deal. See, I could imagine also with the house church, and if it's not very large, boy, when you get slander started, it's going to go around real fast, isn't it? And so they're having to deal with this. Then there's the word that this church did not need to be afraid to suffer. Do not be afraid. It harks back to chapter 1 and verse 17. Remember when John sees the vision to start with? Do not be afraid. The book of Revelation, I think, as a significant sub-theme, it kind of runs through the whole book. And there are places where it's implied and he doesn't really say it straight out. But boy, you can tell it's what he's doing. The book of Revelation is to help God's people not to be fearful no matter what's going on. And we need to hear that reassurance, don't we? That don't be afraid, no matter what's going on, the Lord's got this. And we need to hear that. So don't be afraid. The human propensity to fear when suffering is staring us in the face is really strong. When we think we're about to suffer, fear kicks in. The word of the angel here is a word of preparation. Suffering coming, you can count on it. Remember where Paul told Timothy, Timothy, yea, all that will live godly will suffer persecution. Suffering in all of its forms may be a part of living the godly life. Now, we'd rather it not be that way. Wouldn't it be neat if we could say, well, the more godly you are, the easier life is? Well, that's not how it works. It's actually the opposite, isn't it? It seems like the more godly you are, the tougher life gets. Now, this suffering is for the duration of 10 days. And here's the huge question. Now, is this literal 10 days or is this a figurative 10 days? Okay? And it raises the ever-present question in the book of Revelation about time. When time comes up, do we take those as literal or those references as symbolic? MacArthur, in his commentary on Revelation, says this about the 10 days. There's no compelling reason in the text that says we cannot take it literal. It would be communicating the fact of a brief but very intensive time of suffering. And that may be true, that there's no reason why we can't take this as literal. And so what the word is, be prepared. There's going to be 10 days that are going to be really intense. Now, he doesn't say what it is, doesn't say what's coming. He's just telling them it's coming. Now, the church was going to be tested by the devil. To start off, he says some are going to be put in prison. And the charge here would be, and we know this from early documents outside of the Bible, but from the Roman perspective, the charge is that it's a criminal offense just for you to claim to be a Christian. You didn't do anything bad, but it's a criminal offense to wear the name Christian. Prisons in the ancient world, and I've got a picture up here, and this is what archaeologists have uncovered as several of these, but prisons in the ancient world were often underground with horrible living conditions. If you've ever watched old movies and seen some of those dungeons, we call them, prisons, you don't see any light, you're chained up maybe. Every now and then you'll get stale food thrown to you. You might get a little bit of water. Prisons in the ancient world were horrible. And so Satan's going to test you. Some are going to be put in prison. And this is to be understood as a time of testing. Testing is finding out what we're really committed to and if we are committed. In fact, literally, here's what it says. You will be thrown in prison in order that you might be tested. That's the literal wording. In order that you might be tested. So the question for us today is, do you think that the devil actively tests us today like that? Behold, he says in the verse, the devil is about to cast you into prison. The New Testament has a much more active role of Satan in the world than I'm comfortable with. I'm just going to say it that way. I don't like the idea that Satan's running around loose. In the book of Revelation, we find out that he is. But here's the cool thing. In the book of Revelation, I was reading just this week again the section where it talks about, Michael and the archangels. They fought against Satan. Satan wasn't strong enough, so it says he was kicked out of heaven with his angels. And then at the end of that little episode, it says, because his time is short. So one of the things that the book of Revelation says that I'm just so thankful, and I want us to hang on to it like crazy as we go through the book of Revelation. Satan is not all powerful. I mean, his being thrown out of heaven with his angels demonstrates that. Also, he's not going to always run around free to do whatever he wants to do. His time is short, and he knows it. Not all powerful, and not going to be doing it forever. Wow, what good news. Okay? The active role of the devil in testing means that he's not passive. When the Bible talks about the devil, it's not just a spiritual representation of what's evil. Rather, the devil is actively involved in trying to destroy God's people. And I think parallels can be drawn between Job in the Old Testament and Christians in the book of Revelation. We don't get to see behind the scenes, and Job didn't. If you read the book of Job, it's amazing what we know that went on behind the curtain that Job didn't even have a clue. Like, oh. So I believe that there's spiritual warfare, things going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of, and yet it's being constantly fought by Jesus and his angels on our behalf. And then last of all, the church is encouraged to be faithful. Here we go. The church is encouraged to be faithful. The idea of faithfulness is related to the covenant. This verse in chapter 2 and verse 10, be faithful unto death, has been one of encouragement for countless generations of Christians, suffering Christians through the years, because we know that Christians can be faithful even to the point of death because God is faithful. Even to the point of death, faithfulness is being encouraged because some are going to lose their life. And that's the thing in Revelation that was discouraging, is that some of the Christians were actually watching brothers and sisters in Christ being put to death. See, think if that were going on in our church here, that we heard during the week somebody was put to death precisely because they're a Christian, how would that affect us? See, so it was affecting the church at Smyrna. Sometimes in the ancient church in the early centuries, just the threat of death was enough to make some Christians defect and go back to their prior pagan life. And it happened a lot. But in this letter, it says, if you'll hold on and overcome, you'll receive the crown of life. And this crown is the victor's crown that was often given in races, which means the race has been run, the victory has been enjoyed, and you have the reward of the victor's crown being placed on your head. And that's another thing that's fascinating in the book of Revelation. There are references over and over to the Christian's reward after this life is over. Part of, not all, part of our motivation for remaining faithful is our reward. I'm looking forward to that. I hope you are too. And these early Christians were being encouraged at the end of this race. You don't know how long it's going to be. Your race may be over tomorrow. But no matter how long your race is, you will receive the victor's crown. And then notice how he ends it. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. And later on in the book of Revelation, we're going to find out what that second death is. We don't fear the first death. We should fear the second death. We don't want to partake in that one. What we want is the second life. And that's what Revelation is providing. Reward, second life, forever in the presence of God. And that keeps us faithful no matter what. So this little church at Smyrna, poor pitiful me little church, going through afflictions, very poor, but Jesus tried to tell that church, look, you are rich. And we need to remind ourselves over and over, doesn't matter how many or how few we are in our assembly before the Lord, we are rich. I'm thankful that this is the message of that particular letter to Smyrna. This morning, the invitation hymn is being offered. Maybe you need to enjoy the riches of your journey with Jesus, and you've forgotten that. And in this song, number 62, Bring Christ Your Broken Life, I love the imagery because you can bring to him all the broken pieces. And through God's grace, put all the pieces back together again. So let's stand and sing number 62, as the invitation hymn.